asking, no system can endure indefinitely. And can we survive? I am talking beyond the short term, but I think it's worth thinking in the extreme long term, which is the very essence of our civilization. And what can we do now? How do we need to alter things currently in order to address the true existential risk that we have that is, very rarely considered? So can I just make a little stab at that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I've already, talked about the idea that we have to be robust. We have to look longer term. And the real longer term, as this question indicates, is the risk of collapse of civilization. And unfortunately, when we think of civilization, the scope of civilization is so long that we tend not to really think about it. It's sort of beyond where we would think. Like climate change, we know can be an existential risk. But when we look at climate change, we look at it maybe 30 years out, maybe 50, at the most 100 years out. When some of us are at the end of our lives and we're sitting with our children and our grandchildren and maybe our great-grandchildren, we will have sitting by us progeny who will still be alive maybe 150 years from now, maybe even longer. So that is a term we ought to at least be thinking about if we care about our children and our grandchildren, maybe our great-grandchildren, where we can almost sort of touch it, where we literally will see them over the span of our lives. If we're looking at civilization, 250 years out is not far. And yet we don't look at the path of where the current direction of climate change might be 150, 250 years out. If it's as bad as we put it 50 years out, it's going to be far worse at that point. So I think the key thing is to maintain a very, very long-term perspective, to understand what the structure we have now in terms of short-term orientation and lack of robustness can mean over that length of time. I'm actually working on I've written a paper, which I hope will end up in a book, that I call From Wild West to Mad Max, the Life Cycle of Civilization. And the key point in there is that there's an interplay between the connections we create as a society and the dependence that we pull together based on those interconnections and the rise and fall of a civilization. And this is true for the late Bronze Age, for Rome, for the Han Dynasty. Essentially, what occurs is we have connections that gradually sputter along with fits and starts, with alliances that form and break, which I call the Wild West, thinking of the Wild West in the US. Finally, connections emerge that are strong enough to create interdependence. And civilization basically results from these connections and the interdependence due to those connections. Well, on the other side, with the collapse of civilization, the first thing to go are the connections, whether it's from war, climate change, famine, or whatever. And the problem is the connections break, but we still have the dependence because we can't retool quickly enough in the face of these quickly breaking connections. And so we end up in this world that I call Mad Max, which is based on the Mad Max movie, where, but you could think of, I can't remember the name of the movie, but where it starts out with a car being pulled by horses. We have this world that seems very strange because we're trying to hold on to the dependency and interconnections that we had, but we don't have the infrastructure for it. I think that we need to look forward and sort of admit that we can have connections that will break. Globalization will break. Supply chains will break in an irretrievable way. How do we maintain a civilization in the face of that? That's where the essence of robustness needs to lie, and that's where the current structure that comes from capitalism, as I've defining it, prevents us from going.